conversation on fiscal policies in the aftermath of the crises that we have been going through, but also in view of the challenges that are going to lie ahead. And we're going to have this conversation based on two reports that have just been produced, one by the World Bank, the other by the IMF. The World Bank report is a poverty and shared prosperity report that comes out regularly. And this is really the first time that this report delves into just how much and how precisely recent crises have had an impact on poverty and on the fiscal challenges in at strained times. The IMF report is the Fiscal Monitor, which is also one of the regular flagship reports produced by the IMF. And the Fiscal Monitor looks also at this question of how you manage fiscal policy in a way that protects the vulnerable during a time when there is a cost of living crisis affecting most countries, and at the same time, there is pressures on inflation. So you want to make sure that any support you provide is working with monetary policy rather than, in a way, pushing in the other way. And if you remember, I think Kristalina Georgieva used this analogy that if you can't have monetary policy pushing on the brake pedal and the fiscal policy on the accelerator, and at the same time, you do need to support people who need support during this period. So the question is, how do you balance the brake and the accelerator? And of course, the same issue in many developing countries where the scope for providing that kind of support is even more limited given the buffers that have been used up over the last few years. So we're going to have about an hour, and the way we're going to do it is Indermit Gill, who's the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank, is going to lead off with a short presentation on based on the Poverty and Shared Prosperity report. Then Paulo Moro, from the Deputy Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department, is going to give a presentation based on the Fiscal Monitor. So we'll have 7 minutes apiece from Indermit and from Paulo. And then we have two discussants who are going to come in and offer their perspectives. And it's Wendy Edelberg, who's the director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings, and Garance Génicot, who is at Georgetown University. So they will come on then we'll have a conversation based on their presentations as well and their own perspectives. So, got a packed program, and I'd like to then invite Indermit to start us off, please.
Thank you very much, Masood. I think I should be able to click with, I'm just going to check quickly. There you go. Yep. All right. So first, thank you very much. Thanks also to Sanjeev for actually organizing this. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, Masood, with Paulo, with Garance, and Wendy. And we're going to discuss what is happening to poverty around the world and the potential of fiscal policy for reversing setbacks in poverty reduction and global income inequality, right? So I'm going to quickly take you through some slides. And as Masood said, these findings are from the Poverty and Shared Prosperity report that the World Bank publishes every other year. It's actually a wonderful report for people who track poverty and inequality trends. This year, though, it's not wonderful reading, it's very depressing reading, right? So I'll take you through some slides that my colleagues have prepared, but I'll give you the punchlines up front. So there are three main findings. The first one is that poverty reduction appears to have come to a halt, and the world will not achieve the 3% extreme poverty target by 2030. In fact, it won't even come close. The second is that global inequality actually went up in 2020 as income convergence between countries went into reverse. And this problem actually persists today as the recovery in per capita incomes in the poorest economies has been lagging those in advanced and upper middle income countries. And the third one is that the pandemic and the lockdowns and other things that followed after that revealed the limits of redistributive fiscal policy in countries that have nearly all of the world's poor. These are low-income countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and these are middle-income, low middle-income countries like India. Right? And these countries, we say, need to prioritize fiscal policies for economic growth, not for income redistribution. Okay, so I'm going to now depress you for 5 more minutes. The first thing that the report basically says is that a course correction is needed because poverty reduction has stalled. It was slowing before COVID-19, and it has essentially ended during the last 3 years because of the pandemic, because of conflict, because of inflation. 2020 and 2022 are the worst 2 years for poverty reduction since we started keeping score. Okay? The second is that the global extreme poverty rate will remain above 6%, so twice the target rate of 3%, unless we do something about it. And the report also finds that poorer countries are lagging, so global inequality is higher today than it was 3 years ago. So I guess if you look at poverty generally, you find that nearly half of the world, over 3 billion people, still live on less than $6.85 per day. This is the typical national poverty line of upper middle income countries. So as soon as you start to sort of look at poverty lines that are not just the extreme poverty line of around $2 a day, but $4 or $7, it actually it makes for very depressing reading. So we say in the report that we need a major course correction, but we know how to make this. We actually know how to make this course correction because we know what actually leads to poverty reduction. What leads to poverty reduction is broadly based growth, economic growth. It involves investments in human capital, education, health, and well-targeted social protection programs to help people deal with shocks like pandemics, conflict, or inflation. And the subset of all of these policy actions that are at the subset of policy actions that are at the intersection of all three of these things is fiscal policy, right? And that's the reason why the focus of the PSPR this time was fiscal policies. So let me just take you through a few slides very, very quickly. And so this slide actually shows that the fiscal policy response to COVID-19 actually protected welfare, but less so in low and lower middle income countries, right? So if you look at this, you actually find that fiscal policy measures did make a noticeable difference in reducing the pandemic's impact on poverty. So the average poverty rate in developing economies would have been about 2.5 percentage points higher without this fiscal response. But government spending proved to be far more beneficial to poverty reduction in wealthier economies, which managed to fully offset COVID-19's impact on policy, COVID's impact on poverty through fiscal policy and other emergency support measures. If you look at upper middle income countries like China and others, they offset just 50% of that poverty impact, and low and lower middle income countries offset barely a quarter of that impact, sometimes less, right? And the main reasons, of course, are things that you all probably know very well. The first one is lack of access to public finance, weaker delivery systems, and the large informal sector in lower income countries that makes it impossible to protect jobs. Okay. Next slide. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long. Okay. So if you look at this, you actually find that taxes, transfers, and subsidies do reduce inequality, but in many low income countries and low middle income countries, they actually reduce the consumable income of the poor. That's basically what this slide says. Right? Then if you look at this slide, it says some of the highest value added fiscal policies actually are those that have high long run returns, and so they can be hard to prioritize. And the report actually provides a lot of evidence that the fiscal policies that give the largest bang for the buck in terms of growth and poverty reduction shows that investments that pay off the most are those with these long-term or long-run impacts, like investments in education and health, investments in infrastructure and R&D, right? The problem is because their impacts are in the long run, they can that can actually make them hard to stay as priorities during crisis times. So we end up with these three fiscal priorities, probably in order. So the first one is to reorient spending from subsidies to targeted support for growth. The second one is to prioritize spending for long-term growth, even in times of crisis. And then finally, actually mobilizing domestic resources without increasing poverty in the short run. And the reason why we say this, that it's number three, is because it's very difficult to do this. Okay. And let me come close to the end of the slides. This is the last slide, I think. And it shows that, that improving fiscal policy can actually help recover losses, but this requires fairly ambitious efforts. And they will not by themselves end extreme poverty. You need other things, but even within fiscal policies, one needs to prioritize economic growth in low income and even in lower middle income countries. I think that's the end of it. This is just the same thing again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Indamid. That was really helpful. And the slide that you had two before this, I think we will come back to in the discussion, because that slide there, because I think this is sort of the generalized advice that is coming from fiscal economists everywhere, and it's the advice that politicians everywhere, whether in Germany or in India or the UK or in DRC, find very hard to follow, because it's very hard at the moment to target rather than be broad-based. So we'll come back to that in the conversation. But thank you for that. I'm going to turn now to Paolo, if I may, and have Paolo do his presentation, then we'll come back to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masood. Thank you to the CGD and Sanjeev Gupta for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm especially pleased that these two reports are so complementary. So I hope that we can have a very good discussion where we compare these lessons. The report that I'm going to speak about, the IMF's Fiscal Monitor, the title is Helping People Bounce Back. Let me acknowledge up front that it's a team effort, and I especially want to thank Rafael Lam, who led the team, and Paulo Medas, who heads the division that produces the Fiscal Monitor every 6 months. So what we do in this report is we ask how fiscal policies help people survive economically and bounce back from the pandemic and from adversity more generally. And we think that there are lessons for the current crisis, the current energy and food price crisis, but also for future crises. Of course, we don't know when, we don't know the nature of future crises, but some of these lessons will be relevant going forward. Before I delve into the messages on social safety nets and so on, let me, however, remind us of the macroeconomic context in which this report is written. And as you've already alluded, Masood, in your remarks earlier, in March 2020, when the pandemic began, we made a case for very forceful fiscal support. And if you remember, at the time, the concern was deflation, and central banks provided ample liquidity. There was a concern about economic implosion. Today, obviously, the macroeconomic concern is inflation. So it's a very different situation. And you will see that countries have moved from a situation in which they had fiscal loosening and monetary loosening to a situation where they're tightening the fiscal stance. So essentially, the recommendation now at the macro level is, as was mentioned earlier, is to provide fiscal support to those who need it within a tightening fiscal stance. So essentially, we don't want to add fuel to the fire of inflation. If we look at how the situation has changed in terms of borrowing costs and debt vulnerabilities, we also see that both have risen quite substantially. So just to take sovereign bond spreads, which are my favorite indicator of vulnerabilities for frontier economies and from emerging markets, you see that sovereign bond spreads are a lot higher today, particularly for the frontier economies, than they were a year ago or 2 years ago. So the trade-offs have become much more challenging. And that's the case, again, even more so for the low-income countries. So what are countries actually doing right now? What are they trying to do to help people during the food and energy price crisis? There's a plethora of measures. And if you look at all countries, probably each of them has a mix of good and not so good measures. We see certainly that some measures are those that we would advise, such as targeted cash transfers. We also see, however, that particularly when it comes to measures that are focused on support in the face of rising energy prices, those tend to be in the form of price controls, generalized subsidies, and unfortunately, those types of measures do not provide incentives to conserve energy. So the upshot is that because the energy price shock is likely to be long-lasting, some of these measures will ultimately prove not only ineffective, but also unaffordable. I will just note on a slightly more positive note that low-income countries have focused on food security, whereas advanced economies and emerging markets somewhat more on the energy side. So the focus on food security for low-income countries is quite appropriate. Good options are available to provide measures. And in fact, this is what we've learned during the pandemic. We certainly document that in the report in great detail. What we have learned in particular is that social support measures, including targeted cash transfers, can be deployed quickly and effectively. So the old notion of fiscal policy was that fiscal policy is slow, you cannot really use it in a crisis, but we've seen that with political consensus in the midst of a massive crisis, actually fiscal policy can act extremely fast and be very impactful. What I'm showing here in the chart is the case of Brazil. In the case of Brazil, there was an ambitious program, in particular the Auxílio Emergencial program that was above and beyond existing programs that you're familiar with, like Bolsa Familia, which were expanded a little bit, but this was the big one. What happened in the case of Brazil is not only that in 2020 poverty did not rise, as you might have expected, but actually poverty declined substantially in 2020, thanks to this very ambitious program. As these measures were scaled back in 2021, poverty went up again somewhat. And clearly the lesson from this type of episode is that fiscal policy and these cash transfers can be very impactful. However, one has to think about how can these programs be designed in a way that they are also cost effective. So it's important to reach people, it's important to make a difference, but also it's important to do so in a way that is not overly expensive, because those resources that as we just heard before, are very scarce at this time. So in the report, we go through some of the conditions for making these programs cost effective. And what's really important is to be prepared ahead of time. And that's the lesson for the future. In particular, it's important to be able to use information sets that are pre-existing. What's especially important is to have information about the recipients, the types of households, the number of children, and so on and so forth, the ability to verify eligibility and to deliver payments as well. So this is my last slide. what I'm showing here is a few examples of countries at various levels of income. And here we're really ranging from very low income countries to the more advanced type of emerging economies. All of these countries had the mix of expansion of existing programs and introduction of new programs. And what's really important, I think, here is that in most of these cases, there was creative use of digital technology. Just to take some examples, in Togo, they didn't have a very good ID system, but they used voter registration to identify the potential recipients of programs. In other countries, people started using mobile banking, which allows you to reach people in rural areas that otherwise would be very difficult to reach. So bottom line, very rich international experience to learn from, and we can develop some of these examples in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And again, I'm sure we'll come back to this, because the question of how much we can now build on the progress that's happened over the past 3 years in terms of digital systems, and can we generalize that progress and start using digital systems not just during times of crises, but more generally to better target, is going to be something that I'm sure we'll come back to. So now what we'd like to do after the two presentations, while Hunter very nicely moves that podium out of the way and puts an extra chair there, is to get our panelists up on the stage. So in addition to having Indermit and Paolo come up, this is the moment to invite Wendy Edelberg and Garance Génicot also to please come and join. And what we'd like to do, what we'd like to do is to ask Wendy and Garance to give us their reactions to the reports and also their own perspective on these issues as scholars. And then we will open it up for a conversation. So I think in my scheme of things, Wendy, you are first in the list. If that's all right, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, excellent. So I very much enjoyed reading these two reports. And I also very much wish I had had them in hand when the Hamilton Project, which I direct, and the Hutchins Center, which is also at Brookings, put together a book with a slew of chapters thinking about, completely US focused, what the lessons we should draw from the enormous fiscal response that the US put in place in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and more precisely the recession. And so I think I'm partly here to describe some of those findings, acknowledging that this is all from a US perspective. So I will just run through them very quickly and, of course, advertise that it's available on our website. And I encourage everybody to look at it, and it was a monumental effort, and I'm really proud of it. Okay, so I think we learned...
We'll make sure we put a link to that in the when we send this out. Yeah.
So first, we learned that a strong, broad, and inclusive social insurance system provides effective relief. So like you were showing for Brazil, in the United States, poverty rates fell in 2020 and in 2021, which is an enormous achievement. And I know we'll come back to what is the best kind of fiscal response in the midst of a crisis, and how the recent economic developments, particularly with inflation, will influence that response. I certainly hope that U.S. policymakers don't unlearn the lesson that we can, with a robust enough response, keep poverty from rising in the midst of a crisis. It also, we need to learn how to better target and to size and to make most effective a fiscal response. And we didn't have the infrastructure to do it most optimally, and we still don't have the infrastructure. We also learned in the U.S. that very generous unemployment insurance benefits didn't seem to have the negative incentive effects that we worried about. There were certainly some negative incentive effects with regards to people's willingness to work, but even after the labor market began to bounce back and got stronger, we saw that generous UI was not the margin on which people were making their decisions. And I think that should motivate the United States to dramatically expand unemployment insurance and use it more effectively as tools in economic crises. What we did for the business sector was, particularly with the Paycheck Protection Program, was ill-targeted and more expensive than it needed to be. And very likely, because of the very extensive fiscal support that we had put in place for the household sector, unnecessary. And so the business sector in the US did remarkably well in the midst of the pandemic, largely because of the enormous fiscal support that buoyed aggregate demand, but also because of the nature of the pandemic. Businesses, unlike in a normal recession, were actually able to shut down and dramatically reduce their fixed costs, which helped to keep their profits high. I think this is a lesson not just about how we can better target support to the business sector in the midst of a crisis, but also how to think about collections of policies and to not have teams working on each individual policy without then talking to each other and saying, well, I'm working on support for the business sector. Let me go talk to the UI team and figure out what they're doing and how that'll affect the business sector. Yeah, so we learned a lot about the state and local economies and what state and local sectors need. I'll jump over that, but I encourage you all to look at the book. And we need to, so I talked about how part of the reason that our response was suboptimal in the US is because we didn't have the administrative capacity to do it better. And, it's an enormous frustration that is not one of the highest priorities now for policymakers to improve that administrative capacity. Similar to the digital platforms that Paulo talked about and how they were used, used in novel ways to get support out, the US used administrative data and all sorts of new and, stood up surveys in the midst of the crisis in innovative ways to get information in a way that we haven't used in recessions before. And it wasn't all good. Some of it led us astray, but it was enormously helpful and a tool that then we should use going forward. Do I have a minute more?
You have a minute more.
Excellent. So one thing that I just want to put on the table is, we also thought about monetary policy and the relationship between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And it's my sense that in the US, because we borrow in our own currency, because debt markets are so very deep, and the strong role of our central bank, as long as inflation is not unwelcome, is not too high, well above the Fed's target, and the Fed in the U.S. wants to have accommodative fiscal policy. Roughly speaking, fiscal space is not a constraint in the U.S. Now, if monetary policy is tightening, then we're in a very different world. But I thought about this in the context of both publications talking about how fiscal space in other countries that don't have this enormous borrowing capacity, that fiscal space was a constraint. And here, I just want to put on the table that I think what fiscal space does, or what borrowing in the midst of a crisis does, is it allows a country to absorb the pain of a shock and smooth over time, and basically push some of that pain into the future. Without fiscal space, you can still smooth the pain or the burden of the pain. You just have to do it within a country within a period. And so you then have to, you have to put in place redistributive policies that have some households who are better able to absorb the pain, and redistribute resources to other households who are less able. And I wonder if the reason why that kind of policy in the midst of a crisis is not more common is because it makes the, you know, it makes the absorption, that's not the right, that's a terrible word, the bearing of the pain very salient. And if a country is able to borrow, it's able to like make that pain rather diffuse of who's bearing it, paying back the debt, higher interest rates over time. It's actually able to make that, in a sense, obfuscated. And I think in the United States, there was even a narrative that monetary and fiscal policy was going to negate the pain of the COVID-19 pandemic and recession, which is not right. We absorbed a lot of it in real time, but we also smoothed the burden of it over time. And the pain, I think we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that climate change is going to, it's going to lower incomes, that an economic crisis lowers income, that you know, the pandemic lowered income, and it's a question about how we can use fiscal policy to redistribute that pain. And getting buy-in then necessitates wealthier people, people with more resources, saying, we will absorb more of it. And I think that's the heavy lift.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Thank you. And we will, I think this whole issue we'll come back to in the conversation. Is two things that you've raised, which we'll come back to, I'm sure. One is this issue of whether moving or whether our inability to do more targeted support was due to administrative problems or to political difficulty of doing targeting. And you sort of ended a bit, I took away from your last comment, that the politics makes it harder to target during time frame. And the second issue is the one about, of course, you can spread it over time. I mean, if you can borrow, you can move things over time. And in addition, there is a legitimate argument to spreading it over time, which could be that undertaking things over time allows you to do them in a better way, as well as just trying to do them all at the same time. But it's also politically easier. And it's not just in a crisis. You could argue that the history of many massive expenditure increases in many countries, including the US, going back many years now, has been essentially to do them on borrowed money. And it's easier to spend on borrowed money because you don't ask people to make the difficult decisions of paying for those additional expenditures now. So I think you're getting at a very big issue there. Garance, I want to turn to you last and get your perspective, please.
Yes.
You have
if
some
it's
slides
okay,
also. Yes,
I had prepared some notes, and so if it's okay. Yes. So, sorry, I'm used to discussion with slides. So, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the wonderful opportunity to discuss the IMF and the World Bank report. I very much enjoy reading it. Certainly, my takeaway from the report is first the huge inequality in the size of the response for what initially, at least region by region, in terms of percentage of GDP, was not so different. And then what you see from this map clearly is in high-income countries, you have a response that is above 5%. In low and middle-income countries, it is below, sometimes below 2.5%. So not surprisingly, the recovery resulted in a huge increase in global inequality. I really enjoyed the focus of the IMF report on the need for automatic stabilizer. It does make a lot of sense. You know, you took the example of the US, and yes, at the end, poverty did not decrease in 2020 thanks to the stimulus package that was very generous. But for a while...
Did not increase.
Increase.
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Did not increase
Yes.
because of the
Yes.
stimulus package that was very generous. But it took a while to get there and a lot of uncertainty on when and where it would happen, people being fired left and right, not having, you know, food to deliver to their family before receiving a huge shock. And so the question of, you know, knowing that help is going to come and the exact timing of the response is really key. And for the same amount of money, the predictability and the timing of the help can make huge difference. And also it avoids a lot of the political discussion coming in the way of effective help and may help with targeting, which is a huge issue. For the focus on the job retention scheme in high-income country was very interesting. But, and again, you know, related to some of Wendy's comments, I would like to see some careful thinking about comparison between job retention scheme and unemployment benefits. You know, in countries with a lot of labor rigidities, in which you cannot easily fire people and shrink, you know, it's not clear to me why any help should go to the business, or at least to maintain the business. If the rent and the lease are frozen, and if they can easily shrink, then what you can do is, yes, have, you know, the state pay the wage bill, but going directly to the household, to the workers, as opposed to going via the firm. While you know, it makes sense if you have a lot of wage rigidity, it makes sense that you need to keep your workers because the legislation does not make it easy. But then the state can directly pay the workers and make it go, like in Europe, make it go via the firm, but you're paying the workers directly, not giving grants to firms like in the US for job retention, where the money, you know, only a fraction of it actually goes to the workers. So I think there's a lot of thinking about, you know, which tool makes sense, and I think the rigidity of the labor market is key in deciding whether it should be an employment scheme versus job retention. I would like to see, you know, a lot more assessment of the relative effectiveness of support to firms, depending on their size, especially those large firms, because the bulk of the money was actually going to firms, and I'm not sure. What is the effect of fiscal policy on competitiveness? Has it decreased or increased market power, which comes back to then the inflation response that follows? Because if supporting those big business has actually increased the problem of high concentration in the hands of a few firms that we have, then, you know, the inflation response might have been worsened by the fiscal support. So those are questions that I had. Thinking about the automatic stabilizer and the need to think about, you know, not just via job and unemployment response, but thinking about the inflation, I was very surprised that there was not much discussion of indexation as an automatic stabilizer. Like, to me, it should be automatic that minimum wage should be indexed, for instance. Okay, you know, in Belgium and Luxembourg, it's automatically indexed. In many advanced countries, France, Greece, Japan, Portugal, even Turkey, you would have in the annual revision of the minimum wage, they take into account prices and price increase, and then you have Canada and US where, you know, there's nothing. So thanks to a high job demand, the wage have been increasing, but it's not automatic, and it avoids so much political decision. If minimum wage is indexed, you can think about unemployment benefits being linked to wages, pensions, at least for the lower income. It seems to me that a lot of the automatic stabilization can happen. I would have liked to see, that came more in the World Bank report than in the IMF report, but, a lot of, recognition that this is a multidimensional shock. It's not just an economic shock, but we have had so an economic shock has consequences into many dimensions. But here, in addition, it is a multidimensional shock. It has hurt health, physical and mental. Education has taken a huge hit. Gender dimension has taken a huge hit. So I think it's very important to measure recovery along those multiple dimensions. We are lacking a lot of data in order to be able to, look at inequality along all those dimensions. But we should also think about securing automatic stabilizers in those dimensions as well. In developing countries, we have had a huge increase in poverty. We saw that the fiscal responses was quite limited. There's limited fiscal capacity. The large informal sector, of course, and the fact that you have a lot of micro-entrepreneurs and service sector is huge, makes it very difficult to go via the job supporting scheme to help. And so there was a lot of reliance on cash transfers and subsidies. Cash transfers in some countries could reach people. We saw the example of Brazil that was tremendous. But it also means that it relies on whoever was the recipient in the database for that cash transfer, and you might miss a lot of vulnerable population. And I think about, migrants population in India being left without much support. So we should do much more. And I think that, fiscal policy, we mentioned, infrastructure, education, and more. The World Bank mentioned those more long-term investments. But a lot of our evidence comes from long-term investment, but there can be a lot of preventing spending in terms of infrastructure that is needed for the delivery of help, like infrastructure for the delivery of cash transfer, including to migrant population, thinking about the US, a developed country that does not have the infrastructure to be able to, deliver quick cash transfer to targeted recipient, is mind-blowing, and maybe a lot of investment should be going towards that. A lot of R&D. R&D is a high multiplier. And, it should be in terms of knowledge and technology. There should be investment in production hub, training the next generation, and that should not be just in high-income countries. We have seen that we relied on, genetic sequencing in South Africa, pharmaceutical development in India, Brazil. And so I think there's a lot of infrastructure spending that can happen in low-income countries and on delivery of vaccine and help and what's known as the last mile problem. Delivery
last
issue.
mile for the last word.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Garo. So now we have 15 minutes, and if it's all right with you, I'd like to really focus on two questions on which I'd like your thoughts. First is to just get a little bit more on this issue of the political difficulty of targeting. And Paolo, you talked about in your presentation about the energy subsidies that are in rich countries by and large, also in low-income countries, and then the food subsidies and the food security schemes. You've been saying, the fund has whole reports. Sanjeev is sitting here. There's a whole report done a few years ago about targeting subsidies. And yet, politically, in this environment, politicians find it very hard to target. Are there any good examples that you've found, in the current crisis, of where energy subsidies are being delivered in a targeted way, where there's the response to the increase in gas prices has been the kind of response you would like other countries to think about? Any thoughts on the politics of this? And then the second topic I think I want to go back to is mid-longer term. And in the mid, you said something which has struck me, which is that in low-income countries, primary focus of fiscal policies should be on growth rather than on redistribution, because they don't have the dynamics of redistribution don't really work, is what you're saying there. There just isn't enough scope. And I want to come back to that, because that has lots of consequences for the way in which you think about designing fiscal policies. And at what stage do you start thinking about shifting the balance? That would be worth getting other reactions to. But Paolo, maybe you first.
Sure. And let me first say a couple of words about the more technical aspects of how to deliver targeted cash subsidies. Because I think, of course, the political economy is important, but there are also technical challenges. And then I'll come to the political side. So on the technical side, let's take the example of Colombia. What they did was they expanded some existing programs, and then they introduced some new ones. And when they introduced new programs, they really had in mind the informal economy. And of course, you have the challenge of how do I find out who I need to reach? And what they did is they used a variety of databases. They used databases from the tax side. So people may have been in the informal sector, but at some point they must have paid some tax because they used to be employed or a family member was employed. So that's a potential source of information. Then they also used databases that came from social programs that people may have accessed at some point in the past. And so using a variety of databases, they were able to actually reach some people in the informal economy. Generally speaking, making applications on the web easy to complete, being able to verify the information by cross-checking databases. So again, using digital technology for that, and then using mobile banking. I think so on the technical side, those are all things that can be done. Take the case of India. They have the Aadhaar system for the ID, but they also have a system for mobile banking that talks to the ID system. So all of these things matter. On the political side, of course, we know it's very challenging to persuade people to reduce energy subsidies. Right now, what I would focus on is think about the political cost of inflation in general. And if we can make the case that being more targeted helps us reduce aggregate demand, helps us be a little bit more focused, and we're doing our part to control inflation. Of course, there are lobbies that we can leverage when it comes to controlling inflation. For example, the old in many countries vote, and they are net lenders. So what we want to do in the report for the spring is to actually document these different political consequences of inflation in general. Look, it's challenging to reduce energy subsidies. Another thing that can be done is to explain to the public what you get in exchange. So some countries have said, okay, we're going to cut energy subsidies, but we're going to increase your healthcare. And in some cases, that's been very effective. So there is a certain element of communication. But we certainly know that when you reduce subsidies, when food prices are going up, when energy prices are going up, that's a time when social unrest is likely. And that's underlying some of these concerns in many countries.
Anybody else have any quick points on this targeting point? And I would say not just on energy subsidies, but even on the kind of response in the crisis. In this country, pretty much everybody got a check. And so the question is, what's the politics of trying to limit that? So, Carlos, you had a quick question.
I want to say also in the context of the energy, there's some help that could also be more targeted. For instance, I think the UK had a program where they were going to provide some free insulation for people, and that can be mean tested, and think about decreasing the demand as well to help lower income families to bear the brunt of the support.
I mean, so in the U.S., we were very explicit about the fact that we were not targeting. Checks by their nature are not targeted. One thing to think about as we get better at reaching populations that we didn't, that we weren't traditionally able to reach. That means that we need to do less for the broad population. What I mean by that is my interpretation of one of the reasons why we needed such incredibly broad fiscal support at the beginning of the crisis in the US is because even if we could reach, let's say, 75% of the people in need, because of our informal economy, because of undocumented immigrants, because of migrants who just our infrastructure wasn't going to be able to reach, you basically need checks then to reach those family members and friends and neighbors, because that creates, it's an indirect way of getting help to a broader population. The better able you are to get help to everybody who is financially fragile, the less you need to do in a more sweeping, untargeted way. The other thing that I'll just say about then the current moment, and why targeted relief is so very important, is this issue of when inflation is high, you don't want policies that stimulate aggregate demand. In fact, those are unwelcome. And so to be very clear that what we are trying to do with targeted policies is keep people away from financial ruin. And so to be very, goes back to a political economy question of explaining the policies as we're not trying to offset the shock. We're not trying to keep people from feeling the pain of higher energy prices. That's not possible. It's pain that we simply need to absorb, but we are trying to target people who are on the brink of financial crisis.
So that's a very good point. I guess it links a little bit to what Paolo was saying as a target for the next fiscal monitor also. And I think it also comes back to your earlier point, Wendy, whether we have the infrastructure to identify the ones that are close to the edge.
Yes.
And sometimes the ones that are close to the edge are the ones that targeted programs can't reach because they're outside our formal documented economy. And then they're the ones who fall off. And that's even more the case in developing countries where the systems of, notwithstanding Aadhaar and the host of ID systems and innovations people have used in many developing countries during the crisis to try and identify those in need, there's still a big gaps in that. So that'll be one topic going forward. In the bit, last word, can we come to you a bit on this sort of, so basically are we giving up on fiscal policy for redistribution in low-income countries? That's an important message here.
I was hoping not to speak again because there were like so many things that Wendy said, and Gaurav said that I think would be terrible if low-income countries and low-middle-income countries take any lessons from that, all right? So I hope they actually think, I'm not even sure whether the US should take those lessons, but because if you look, for example, if you look at the labor market, right now, you had about, 152 million people who were in non-farm employment on the eve of the COVID crisis. And it took 2.5 years to get back to that because of all of these policies. And I think if one actually looks at these policies, Masood, I would sort of say during the pandemic and since then, there has been a huge overreach of government into economic freedoms and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think that these things were really well intentioned, Wendy. I'm absolutely sure that they were intended to protect the weakest and so on. But the government tends not to have the instruments, generally speaking, to protect the weakest. It ends up protecting the relatively well-off, usually, right? And now, it could be, I don't specialize in the United States, but one of the big problems, I think, during the pandemic was things that were being done in the United States had an inordinate influence on the policies in lower middle-income countries, low-income countries, and so on, that did not have the wherewithal. They did not have the fiscal wherewithal. They did not have the administrative wherewithal to actually pull off those policies. So a big mistake that the fund did, that the bank did, I wasn't at the bank, so I can actually say this, that I think that it was we forgot the first rule of development. One size does not fit all. It was, any country like Pakistan or Brazil and so on that wanted to sort of do things differently was censured right away, saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing this. At the end, fast forward now, and we're talking about Brazil as being one of the good cases, okay? But they did not, they were not the darlings of the development community. They were doing, quote unquote, the wrong things, okay? Now, so I actually do believe that there was a huge overreach of these policies. Now, so I think like something like, dramatically expand unemployment insurance. I hope no low-income country or no low-middle-income country takes that. I'm not saying you're saying that for them, but there is a tendency to sort of, generalize these things, saying, oh, this worked in France, so it should work in Malawi. It doesn't happen, right? Now, the other thing I sort of see is that, I mean, if one looks at the inequalities, Wendy, you have countries that are low-income countries. They spend something like between $53 and $83 per student per year. Okay? Now, if you look at high-income countries, they spend an average of nearly $8,000 per student per year. Okay, 8,000, right? If you have any semblance of trying to sort of shut down businesses and so on, or shut down schools, these countries do not have the wherewithal to make up those learning losses and so on. So they're going to pay forever, right? They're going to pay for a long, long time. So anyway, I guess I don't have enough time to sort of go into all of this stuff, but I really hope, I think that you have actually given me a lot of motivation to make sure that during the next 2-3 years, I think I'll actually emphasize this over and over again. Don't do what the US did. Don't do what France did. Don't do what these countries did. Do what you think was the right thing and learn from each other who did the right thing. Maybe India did it. India initially followed the US, shutdowns, this thing, that thing. Afterwards, and they could not sustain it. And then they were bailed out by the fact that you had this really good system of, that you had the Aadhaar, you had a digital ID, and that you had essentially digital ways of things. But just because you have those digital ways of doing it, doesn't mean that you should be using them. You should be focusing a lot more on growth. Right? Now, having said that, it is true that spending on subsidies, the general subsidies, this is a terrible thing, right? Because they tend to be fiscally imprudent. They tend to be socially inequitable, right? 20% of spending on subsidies get to the bottom 40%. One shouldn't do these subsidies compared to 60% of spending on tax runs. I mean, doing cash transfers, even poorly, is better than doing subsidy, general subsidy, even well.
Energy subsidies, you mean? Energy subsidies.
In general, energy and agricultural subsidies. Yeah. Agricultural subsidies. Food, right? So anyway, but again, so many ideas to rebut, so little time. So, yeah.
All right, now, I think that's a different, yet another panel to be had. And maybe based on your next report that you guys will do for the spring. But look, I think that there are two. Well, there's one thing that you've said, which I very much agree with, and one where I think there's a bit more work to be done. The one that I agree with is that I do think that we need to be very careful in transferring lessons from countries that have administrative and financial capacity that is multiples of other countries, and assuming that some scaled down version of the same approach will work. And this is not just a question for subsidies or fiscal policy. You can apply that to the way you organize health, the way you organize education. I think there's a general issue which we need to think about. Where I think we need to do a bit more work then is to be able to say, what is then the right policy if you have limited resources? And that's the point I think you were making in it. For example, it may well be that you can't afford to close down schools in the same way, but then what is the alternative? What are we saying? And I think that's where we do need to do more work. And it's quite interesting that on that question of schools, I think there's recently, if my memory is right on this, and my colleagues Justin Sandfer and Justin was telling me this the other day, that there's sort of survey that we've recently done of education policymakers in developing countries, and broadly they think they got it right in terms of not closing down schools as much, because they feel that that balance worked better for them. And I think that's the kind of thing that we don't do enough to be able to actually understand not just what people think when they have to manage these in different circumstances, but why they think what they think. So
it started out well, Masood, because when you look, I think the first response was that, look, let's shut down schools, let's shut down businesses for 2-3 weeks or something like that to slow the spread and to get health facilities prepared. But I can bet you, I don't know the evidence right now, but I can bet you if you go to these countries now and say, after this such a big health shock, have the health sector institutions changed materially? The answer is no, because we took our eye off the thing that really mattered, which was education and health and infrastructure and things like that, and we got into all of these other things. Digital transfers, let's do more transfers. We got digital, we got this. Just because you have a hammer, everything now starts to look like a redistributed.
So I want to. We're already running over time. 1 minute I want to end with Paolo. 1 minute, girls. Any reactions to this last round? We've got a whole new seminar here.
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, but the conclusion to me does not mean let's just focus on growth. And I think that, within the school closure, even within developed countries, I think we're going to see big differences in the long-term effect on inequality within countries. There's still a lot of data that we are missing to see how much structural increase we will have had in terms of inequality. And I think school closure will be a big thing. And investing into, I think cash transfer have their place, but clearly you want a lot of infrastructure done in terms of delivering it to the people that
You're
need.
right. I wanted to agree with Wendy and disagree with Paolo. I ended up disagreeing with Wendy.
All right.
So I didn't focus very much in what I was saying on school closures. I think that was very specific to the pandemic, and we get into that in the book, of the many consequences of that. But what's relevant here is I think we learned that schools are actually a very effective means of reaching families in crisis with children. And when we shut down schools, it made it much more difficult in the United States for us to reach those families with children. And so I think, at least again with regards to the US, I think we should in fact lean in to using schools as a means of helping families in the midst of crisis.
Yes, that's a very important point, even more so in developing countries,
Yes.
where you could also argue a lot of the evidence now is that probably one of the highest payoff scalable investments you can make at scale in education to improve learning outcomes is school meals.
Yes.
School meals have a much bigger payoff than a lot of other things that we thought would pay off, but which are very hard to do at scale. They can be done in small samples, but it's very hard to replicate the same results at scale. Paolo, last word from you.
Sure. So definitely the amount of support that countries should provide depends on the financing that they have available and the whole host of country-specific circumstances. No doubt about that. I will add that when we talk about sort of spending within one's means, investment for the future is crucial, and investment to me includes investment in human capital, so healthcare, education, and so on, absolutely. And I think we do need to pay special attention to those cohorts that lost a lot of education and even dropped out of education, which is a big concern because that could be a permanent effect. But having said that, preventing the catastrophic personal situation in which somebody goes into poverty and never escapes and never is able to recover, that's important. And I think that's where our reports are very useful because they provide some suggestions for how countries can do this within their means.
I think you said, it was like not trying to prevent the pain. It's more preventing falling off the edge, and you define the edge in different ways.
Yes.
Great. Well, I wish we had another hour, but we don't. So thank you all for participating in this. Thank you, both Paolo and Indimit, for the reports that you presented and your colleagues who put it together. Thank you also, Gauns and Wendy, for your comments. And thank you all for watching this, and we look forward to any comments that you have. Thank you.